Some days you just want to live in peace, mind your business, go about your routine, and not be dragged into some ridiculous neighborhood drama. But when you live next to someone like her, peace isn't an option. Before we dive into this intense story, we have a small favor to ask. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far our stories reach. Thank you so much. Now let's dive in. It was supposed to be a normal day. I had just returned from the mall after picking up the perfect Halloween costume, not some basic vampire cape or store-bought werewolf mask, but a full-blown hyper-realistic zombie getup. Torn, dirtied clothes, fake bloodstains, and a grotesque mask that could have landed me a role in a horror film. I was excited. Halloween was coming up, and this year I wanted to go all out. So I parked in my driveway, tossed my shopping bags in the trunk, and spent a few minutes scrolling through my phone. Just laughing at memes, answering messages, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing suspicious, nothing that should have justified what happened next. But of course, there's always that one person who has too much free time and not enough common sense. That's when I felt it. A burning stare, drilling into the side of my face. Slowly, I turned my head. And there she was, my neighbor, the one who seemed to have made it her life's mission to monitor the entire street like some self-appointed sheriff. She wasn't just looking at me, she was analyzing me. Eyes locked on my car, my movements, my shopping bags, as if she were piecing together an imaginary crime scene. I should have ignored her, but something about the way she stood, arms crossed, head tilted, eyes narrowed, made me uncomfortable. She wasn't just curious. She was calculating, and then without a word, she ran, not walked, not hurried inside. She bolted, like a horror movie victim fleeing a serial killer. I watched in utter confusion as she disappeared into her house, door slamming shut behind her. For a moment, I just sat there thinking, well, that was weird. Then shrugging it off, I grabbed my bags and headed toward my house. I had no idea she was making a call. I had no idea she had convinced herself she was witnessing a crime. I had no idea that in exactly 3 minutes, my peaceful afternoon was about to turn into a full-blown police standoff. I had barely reached my front door when I heard them. Sirens, multiple sirens, loud, close, getting closer. And before I could process what was happening, 3 police cars screeched to a stop right in front of my driveway, lights flashing, tires skidding, doors slamming open. Officers jumped out, some with hands on their holsters, others with their guns already drawn but pointed at the ground. Every instinct in my body screamed, "Something is very wrong." I barely had time to react before one of them, a tall officer with a hardened expression, stepped toward me with purpose. He was looking at me like I had just dumped a body in my backyard. "We've received a report of a possible homicide," he said bluntly. "Wait, what? Murder? Homicide? Me?" I stood there, completely blindsided, struggling to find words. "What?" I blinked, trying to wrap my head around what I just heard. "What do you mean, murder?" For a split second, I thought they had the wrong address. Maybe this was about some other house. Maybe I was just an innocent bystander to some dramatic police action. Then she stepped outside. The caller, the accuser, the neighborhood's self-proclaimed watchdog, standing there on the sidewalk holding her phone like a war trophy, and the second she locked eyes with me, her face lit up in triumph. "He did it!" she shouted, pointing directly at me. "I saw the whole thing! He hid the body in the trunk!" I couldn't even react, because at that exact moment, one of the officers turned toward my car, then toward the trunk, where my Halloween costume was still inside. A hyper-realistic zombie costume, complete with torn, blood-stained fabric and a gruesome mask. The worst part? From a distance, it definitely didn't look like a costume. I turned back toward the police, expecting at least one of them to see how absurd this was, to laugh, to roll their eyes and tell my neighbor to stop wasting their time. Instead, the lead officer's expression hardened, his stance shifted. "Sir, raise your hands and step away from the vehicle." Oh, holy shit. The will to argue died instantly, because the way things were going, any wrong move could land me face first on the pavement. I obeyed, hands up, slow steps to the side, and all I could think was, I'm about to be arrested for a murder that never happened, because my neighbor is a lunatic. The officers moved in, tactical, cautious, weapons still down but ready. One of them reached for the trunk, unlocked it, lifted it open in one swift motion. I braced myself for the inevitable silence, and sure enough, it came. A long, drawn-out pause, 3 full seconds of pure collective confusion. The officer who opened the trunk tilted his head. His partner stepped closer, peering in. Another officer rubbed his face, probably reconsidering his entire career, because inside the trunk, instead of a brutal crime scene, they found a torn-up zombie outfit. Fake blood splattered across the fabric, a grotesque, detailed mask staring up at them, and I swear, I saw one of them suppress a laugh. My neighbor, however, she refused to accept reality. "Wait, what?" she blurted out, eyes darting between the trunk and the officers. "That's it!" She took a step forward as if demanding a redo. "Are you sure?" she cried. I saw blood! That can't just be paint!" The lead officer exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am," he said, clearly holding on to the last strands of his patience, "this is clearly a Halloween costume." But she wasn't done, not even close. She crossed her arms, doubling down. "Even if it's fake," she snapped, "he could still be hiding something. Search his house." The officer turned toward her with a look that could have set concrete on fire. And that's when everything changed. The second the words left her mouth, the energy shifted. For the first time since this insane spectacle began, the officers were no longer looking at me. They were looking at her, and they weren't amused. "Even if it's fake," Karen repeated, arms crossed in defiance, "he could still be hiding something. Search his house." The lead officer, who had already had enough of today, turned to face her, and the exhaustion in his eyes was palpable. "Ma'am," he said, slow and measured, "we don't have any evidence of a crime here." Karen scoffed. "But I saw him. I saw him hiding something." The officer sighed, already reaching for something in his belt pouch. "Fine," he muttered. He pulled out a testing kit, one of those chemical swab tests that instantly detect real blood. I watched as Karen's confidence faltered for the first time, because suddenly she was realizing that if she was wrong, if that red stain in my trunk turned out to be nothing but paint, she was screwed, and she knew it. Karen hesitated, her mouth twitching like she wanted to take back everything she had just said. But at this point, she had committed too hard. So instead of backing down, she dug in deeper. "It doesn't matter," she blurted out. "Even if the blood is fake, he's still acting suspicious. He comes home late. He walks weird. He has to be hiding something." There was a long, painful silence. The lead officer stared at her. Then, very slowly, he turned his head toward me. And the look he gave me said everything. Has she always been like this, or is today special? I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. "Every damn day." The officer inhaled deeply, as if trying to absorb a reservoir of patience. Then he finally spoke. "Ma'am," he said, voice flat, "if you keep pushing this, you're going to be the one in trouble." Karen's face twitched. "What?" "I'm saying," he continued, "that calling the police for a false report is a crime. The tide turns." And just like that, for the first time all day, Karen was silent. No retorts, no arguments, just wide eyes and a stiff posture. She wasn't used to being the one on the receiving end. She wasn't used to being called out, and she definitely wasn't used to losing. The officer pressed his radio. "Run a background check on a local resident. Karen ____. Address redacted." A pause. A voice crackled back. "Copy that! Pulling records now!" Karen shifted uncomfortably. Another officer, a younger one who had been scrolling through something on his tablet, walked over to the lead officer and whispered something in his ear. The lead officer's eyebrows arched. Then slowly he turned back to Karen. "Ma'am," he said, a smirk barely hidden in his voice, "how many times have you called 911 in the last 6 months?" Karen visibly paled. The officer didn't wait for an answer. "Because according to records," he continued, "you've made 13 emergency calls in that time." I almost choked on air. 13? I repeated. The officer nodded, flipping through his notebook. "And the best part? Every single one of them was for nonsense." The officer cleared his throat and began listing them out loud. "In February, you reported an Amazon delivery driver for acting suspiciously because he was carrying a large box. In March, you called 911 on a neighbor because you thought he was dealing drugs, but he was just unloading bags of garden soil. In April, you claimed an unknown vehicle was prowling the street. It was your own neighbor's newly purchased car. In May, you called about a strange man in black lurking around houses. It was the substitute mailman. In June, this one's my favorite, you reported a wild animal wandering the neighborhood. It was a golden retriever. I couldn't help it. I laughed. I laughed so hard I had to put my hands on my knees just to stay upright. Karen, meanwhile, she was turning red, very, very red. She opened her mouth, floundering for words, but the damage was done. People had started to gather outside, neighbors drawn in by the police cars, the flashing lights, the spectacle. And now, they were hearing all of it. The whispers started. Someone murmured, "I knew she was crazy, but not that crazy." Karen heard it, and she knew. She had lost. The officer flipped his notebook closed. "Ma'am," he said, his patience officially gone, "we're recording this formally and forwarding a report to the neighborhood administration." Karen stiffened. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, "that depending on their decision, you could be fined, or even removed from the community." Silence. Pure, glorious silence. I looked at Karen, and for the first time ever, she wasn't talking. She had finally realized what she had done. She had spent years weaponizing the police, harassing her neighbors, playing the victim. And now she was the one facing consequences. She tried to argue, she tried to backpedal, but nobody cared anymore. Not the police, not the neighbors, not me. The officers left. The crowd dispersed, muttering and shaking their heads. And Karen, she stood frozen on her lawn, staring at nothing. Her little empire of paranoia, gone. I let out a breath, finally turning back toward my house. That's when I caught a glimpse of my car, the trunk, the zombie costume still there, the harmless, stupid thing that had started all of this. And I thought, damn, that was the best purchase I've ever made. I thought that was the end of it. That Karen had finally been put in her place. That she'd learned her lesson after being publicly humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood. I was wrong, because the next day, I learned something about Karen that changed everything. It started with a knock on my door. When I opened it, I found Mr. Calloway, an older gentleman who lived a few houses down. A quiet guy, rarely got involved in drama, but right now, he looked uneasy. "Got a minute?" he asked, glancing down the street like he didn't want to be seen talking to me. "Sure," I said, stepping aside. "What's up?" He hesitated before handing me a manila folder. "I saw what happened yesterday," he said. "Figured you might want to know who you're really dealing with." I frowned, flipping the folder open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Inside the folder were clippings, legal documents, and old photos. And right there, staring back at me, a mugshot. Karen, younger, but undeniably her. The charges: fraud, harassment, extortion. She had been arrested years ago in a different town, running the same scam, filing false reports, harassing neighbors, trying to get people kicked out of their homes. And then, when the heat got too much, she moved, started fresh somewhere else, right here. "She's been doing this for years," Calloway murmured, watching as I absorbed the information. "People think she's just some nosy neighbor, but it's more than that. She's dangerous." I looked back at the mugshot, at the reports, at the trail of destruction she had left behind. "Why didn't anyone stop her?" I asked. Calloway exhaled. "Because she knows how to play the system, knows exactly how far to push before the law catches up." "And the HOA?" I asked. He smirked bitterly. "She practically runs it. Half the board is scared of her. The other half?" He shrugged. "They believe her bullshit." I stared at the documents in my hand. Karen wasn't just an annoying neighbor, she was a serial manipulator, a professional liar, a scam artist. And now I had proof. What happens next? I closed the folder, my mind already spinning with possibilities. Yesterday I thought Karen had been defeated. But now I knew the real battle was just beginning, because if Karen thought she could keep getting away with this, she was dead wrong. I sat there staring at the mugshot of my so-called neighbor, feeling the weight of what I had just uncovered. Karen wasn't just a neighborhood nuisance. She was a professional con artist. She had played this game before, and won. Not this time. I closed the folder and looked at Mr. Calloway. "How many people know about this?" I asked. He sighed. "Not many, and those who do, they don't want to get involved. They think it's safer to just let her do her thing." I shook my head. "No, not this time. It's time people know exactly who she is." And that's how I decided Karen's reign of terror was about to end. I spent the next few hours making copies of the folder, everything inside, her mugshot, her previous arrests, her history of harassment. I made enough copies for every single house in the neighborhood, and then I waited until nightfall and went door to door, slipping a folder into every single mailbox. No notes, no explanations, just cold, hard evidence. By morning, the neighborhood was never going to be the same. The next day, I didn't even have to leave my house to know the plan had worked. The murmurs, the whispers, the outrage, I could hear it, the low hum of disbelief rippling through the neighborhood like an oncoming storm. Soft gasps, barely restrained. Whispers behind cupped hands, urgent and sharp, passing from one neighbor to the next like wildfire. Some muttered in shocked disbelief, voices hushed but heavy with anger. "Are you seeing this? I knew she was bad, but this? She's been doing this for years. How did we not know?" Others weren't even trying to hide their outrage. "She scammed us all! She made my life hell! She needs to go!" The murmurs swelled, turning into an almost physical force, a tide of realization crashing down over the street. Karen's name was on every tongue, not in the way she wanted, not with admiration, but with disgust. And as the whispers grew louder, one thing became clear. Karen's stranglehold on this neighborhood was breaking. And Karen? Oh, she knew. She must have known because for the first time since I moved in, she wasn't outside. No pacing the sidewalks, no barking orders at people, no fake phone calls to the police. She had gone silent. Which only meant one thing. She was planning something. The fall of Karen, a neighborhood's reckoning. By noon, the HOA board had called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but that didn't matter because half the neighborhood showed up. For the first time ever, Karen wasn't in control. She wasn't leading the meeting. She wasn't setting the agenda. She was the accused, and it showed. She stood at the front of the room, her back ramrod straight, but there was something different in her posture. Not confidence, not authority, but fear. Still, she wasn't ready to go down without a fight. Her eyes darted across the crowd, scanning for allies, for anyone still on her side. She spotted a few. People who had bought into her lies, who still clung to the illusion that she was some kind of righteous leader. But the rest? They weren't smiling. They weren't nodding along. They were angry. They were fed up. Karen swallowed, tightening her grip on the papers in her hands. "I don't know where those photos came from," she started, her voice wavering, but she pushed forward, forcing the words out. "This is a smear campaign. Someone is trying to ruin my reputation." A few people shifted uncomfortably, but no one jumped to her defense. The silence lingered. Too long, too heavy. Karen needed to push harder. She could feel the power slipping from her fingers. So she did what she always did. She lied. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders, reaching for the last card she had left to play. "If you all would just listen to me," she said, her voice rising with forced authority. "I have proof that this is all fake. In fact," she turned, looked straight at me, and pointed. "He made it all up." The entire room froze. It was like someone had hit pause on reality. Every eye turned to me. She thought she could pin this on me. She thought she could turn the crowd against me, but she had no idea. I was already 10 steps ahead. "Checkmate, Karen." I stood up, calmly. No rush, no panic, just certainty. Reaching into my jacket, I pulled out one last piece of evidence. Karen stiffened, because in my hand was an official police record of her past arrests. Not a photocopy, not anonymous paperwork, a direct copy from law enforcement, signed, stamped, undeniable. The crowd leaned in, eyes widened, whispers turned into murmurs of shock. I held it up for everyone to see. "This," I said, voice steady, "is from the county clerk's office. It's public record. Anyone can verify it. Which means everything in it?" I turned back to Karen. "It's real." The color drained from her face. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in her life, She had nothing to say, no excuse, no manipulation, no control. Just cold, hard truth, exposed for everyone to see. The whispers grew louder. Someone in the crowd muttered, "She lied to us." Another scoffed, "We let her run things for years." The HOA president, usually Karen's biggest enabler, suddenly cleared his throat, shifting in his chair, avoiding her gaze. He wasn't going to save her. No one was. Karen's power was gone, and she knew it. Within 24 hours, the HOA board held another vote. But this time, Karen wasn't leading it. She was the subject of it. And the decision? Unanimous. Karen was removed from the board. Her position, her influence, her control, gone. She tried to protest, tried to argue, to plead, but nobody listened, because no one feared her anymore. And the worst part? This wasn't even her final humiliation. Because remember how I said she had a long history of harassment? Turns out, someone else had been watching. The next morning, just as I was sipping my coffee, I heard it. A knock. But this time, it wasn't a nosy neighbor. It wasn't a fake police report. It was real cops. And they weren't here for me. They were here for Karen. I stepped outside just in time to see the officers standing at her doorstep, serious, no-nonsense expressions on their faces. Karen tried everything. She smiled. She acted confused. She feigned outrage. But the officers, they weren't buying it. Because in their hands was a stack of complaints from previous victims, from her old neighborhood, from people she had harassed before. Karen wasn't just losing her HOA power, she was losing everything. As they led her toward the patrol car, she turned, looked right at me. And the look on her face, it wasn't anger, it wasn't even hatred, it was fear, because for the first time in her life, she had finally lost. And this time, she wasn't coming back. A week later, everything felt different. No Karen, no bogus fines, no fake complaints. For the first time in years, people could actually breathe. There was no tension. No one was afraid to park their car the wrong way. No one was worried about getting some ridiculous HOA violation. The neighborhood belonged to the people again. And me? I just sat on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun set. No drama, no nonsense, no Karen, finally. Peace. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe. Ever had a Karen in your life? Let us know in the comments. And remember, if you stand up to bullies, they always fall. See you in the next one.